Benjamin, are you at least 18 and are you a believer?
Yes, sir, to both.
Cool. And what would be the most convincing evidence or argument for the Christian God being real?
One singular thing, or am I allowed to compound?
I mean, you can do multiples, but we can only really address one at a time, I would imagine.
Okay. I would say what convinced me to give up atheism and go towards Christianity was twofold: the historicity of the Bible, and two, the stance of objective morality having to exist.
Sure. Well, which one do you like to attack first?
I'm good to talk about either, whichever one you want to start with.
Okay. So what about the historicity of the Bible proves that its God is real?
It doesn't. It doesn't back up the truth claims of Christ being God. But if we can verify that all of the names are time period accurate, which would be very difficult to do
Well, they're not
200 years
though.
later. Which ones are not?
There's a bunch of names in the Bible that the timelines are off. The Pharaoh of the Exodus is off by about 200 years. Jesus's birth is off by like 10 different years. The
Well,
length of the Exodus is either 400 years or 430 years or 212 years, depending on which passage you're consulting.
okay. Well, let's go through those. Who is the Pharaoh in Exodus?
According to the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus chapter 1, it appears to be Ramses because it says that they built the storehouses of Pithims and Ramses, which Ramses II was pretty well known for.
Yes, appears to be, but uh, cannot say with certainty. It must be wrong if it doesn't name who it is, right? There is a little ambiguity there.
But did they build the storehouses of Pithom and Ramses?
Yes, that did happen
Okay.
under Ramses, but
Okay.
uh,
So
it,
are you suggesting then that the Israelites in Egypt built the storehouses of Ramses? That seems to be what the text is saying, right?
yeah, I think modern scholarly consensus is that it was Ramses the second, but we can't say that with certainty.
Great. So then the problem you have is, according to the book of Kings, First Kings chapter 6, it dates the Exodus for 400 plus years prior to that. I think 480 years. Want to read it?
Well, when this First Kings takes place, also
So
how are Jewish people counting their years? Is it the same after the Babylonian exile, or is it did they ever adopt Assyrian calendars, Persian calendars? You get really muddy with that pretty quickly.
I don't think so. I don't think it's muddy at all. So I'll explain. It says in First Kings chapter 6, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt, in the fourth year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the second month, he began to build the house of the Lord, referring to Solomon building the temple. So according to First Kings chapter 6, the Exodus was 480 years prior to the building of Solomon's temple, which is virtually unanimously agreed upon by scholars and historians to be roughly 970, 980 BCE, which means, according to First Kings chapter 6, the Exodus would have been in the middle of the 1400s. Follow so far?
Okay.
When did Ramses II live?
Uh, Ramses the second was during the Third Kingdom period. I'm gonna say probably the 900s.
You're off by a little bit. Ramses lived in the middle of the 1200s. He reigned from like 1279 ish to like 1223, somewhere in there. So they could not have built the storehouses of Pithom and Ramses if, in fact, they had already exited Egypt 200 years prior.
Well, how do you know the dating system that they're using in Kings?
Well, it's easy. You can actually just go by the date 605 when the Judeans were invaded by the Babylonians and use the ages of both the Babylonian lineage of the kings and the biblical lineage of the kings, and you can determine that Solomon's temple was built at a particular time period. Also, you don't need much to get you from 970 to 605. We've got Egyptian records. We've got Jewish records, we got biblical records, we got Babylonian records. We kind of have a pretty good idea of when when the invasion began in 605.
Yes, but some of the other examples that you brought up, like Jesus's birth being 10 years off, whatever it is, I mean, that's using the Gregorian calendar, not necessarily what the Jews, the Greeks, the Romans would have used
Nah, it
during
doesn't
that
make a
time.
difference.
And
The solar calendar
it
versus the
doesn't.
lunar calendar only gives you a difference of like 4 days.
Okay, yeah, but you said that Jesus' birth is off, which is impossible because the New Testament
Well,
doesn't tell us
it's
when
certainly
Jesus
not
was born.
possible. Yeah, it says he was born before the death of Herod, right? He went into Egypt, and he stayed there until the death of Herod, Herod the Great. He died in 4 BCE. The book of Luke states that he was born during the census of Quirinius, which is roughly 6 CE. So you're off by about 10 years.
Okay, how do you know that the census of Quirinius is when Josephus said it was?
Well, no one can guarantee anything in history. Like when a historian tells us that something happened while somebody, was alive, you could be off by a couple of years. That being said, we have Roman records as well letting us know when that census was and when Quirinius was governor. So, like, it's not like we're just relying on Josephus. It's also weird that like you pivoted really quick to Jesus's birth without finishing the conversation on Moses.
I wasn't trying to pivot. I was trying to prove that like Josephus is wrong about that. Now, I would be
What
fine with
what evidence do you have that
getting on
Josephus
board.
got it wrong?
Okay, that's I will grant you. Uh, I don't have evidence that Josephus was wrong, but when we put Josephus versus Luke, Luke is right about more things.
Based
So
on
I would
whose
just say
metric?
that.
Who's counting this?
Well, I would say like uh, the title of Pontius Pilate,
No,
procurator
how did
versus
you
perfecter.
determine that Luke is more accurate than Josephus?
Well, in the other example we have of was Pontius Pilate the procurator or the perfecter, Luke is correct. So I would just say that when they go head to head,
What do you think the
I have
difference is?
100. I think it'd probably be like mayor versus head of the city council. Pretty close, but not the same.
Why do you think that?
That is what I have been led to believe based on what I have read.
They're literally both just officials of the Roman government. And the two words that you're trying to work on are English words. Like they don't show up in the Greek.
Okay.
Okay.
Well,
So
the same argument that I made.
you're making a weird like argument based on how two different English translators decided to translate the texts.
Yes, but that is the same point that I made a couple minutes ago about our dating systems. Is that you have how long is a year when they wrote First Kings?
It was a lunar calendar, so you're off by just a couple days compared to the solar calendar. It's not that much.
Okay,
Couple
and
days.
then
I think it's 4. Could be 5. Shit. Let me check.
okay,
How many days in the lunar calendar? Shit, off by 2 days. 1 day. The lunar calendar, as we know it today, has 354 days. So, I mean,
okay,
you you're
and
gonna
then
following the lunar
but
calendar versus the
go
solar
ahead.
calendar isn't going to yield you a difference of 10 years.
Of 10 years.
Yeah,
Well, okay, but we do see in the Bible that there are numbers that there we have problems with between each other.
I agree.
Like I think in First Kings it says that there were 700 soldiers that died on horseback, and in Chronicles it says 7,000.
Yep. I'm very familiar with that.
So
hmm That's in Second
yeah,
Samuel, though, not
so
Kings.
okay, yeah, my bad, Second Samuel. Um, so
So it sounds like you
no,
like cooked
numbers
your
are
own
a bit
argument.
no numbers are a very easy thing to miss to miswrite
But
to get the count wrong. right? I
But
mean, like if I asked you how many votes did Trump get, that's like immediately available, and you'd probably get 50 different answers if you asked 50 different Americans and they didn't have Google to tell them.
but if the question is why is the Bible accurate, and you point to like these accounts with the dates and the numbers, and the dates and the numbers are wrong, then that means the Bible's not all that accurate. Now you're just making excuses for like why it's not accurate. Also, the New Testament couldn't even quote the Old Testament properly. Like, for example, in Mark chapter 2, Jesus says that Abiathar was the high priest when David and his men ate the showbread, but in fact, in 1 Samuel 21, it was Ahimelech. Maybe did Jesus not
Well,
read the Old Testament or what?
I am unfamiliar with that, so
We can read it real
I'll give
quick.
you the
It's Mark
yeah.
2:26.
Yeah.
I'll put it on the screen. So in Mark 2:26, he says, he entered the house of God when Abiathar was the high priest and ate the bread of presence, which it is not lawful for any to eat but the priest, so on and so forth. And of course, Matthew cleans this up. When Matthew tells the same story, he just leaves out the name of Abiathar because Matthew's like, oops, that was the wrong guy. But if you go to 1 Samuel 21, it's clear that the priest acting in charge was Ahimelech. David came to Nob to the priest Ahimelech, and Ahimelech came trembling, so on and so forth. And then you get the whole narrative of David eating the showbread. So, like, if Jesus can't even get his history right, I don't really have a whole lot of hope for the rest of the Bible.
Yeah. Okay. So I would say two things. I'd say three things because one, I don't want to run from legitimate arguments. So uh, like I will chalk that up to you're correct. That's got to be a mistake. Um, but two, I would say I never claim the Bible's perfect. Right? When I read like this, the commentaries on the Civil War, I take that as history from Julius Caesar, but I also keep in the back of my mind, okay, some things could be incorrect. Or when I read, Herodotus, whatever, there's a lot wrong with Herodotus, but you know what I'm saying. Um,
Yeah,
so
but were
could there
those
be
written by
mistakes?
God?
Absolutely. Well, the whole idea of biblical inerrancy wasn't even held by Justin Martyr or Polycarp. Like that's a very in terms of the grand scheme, that's in the last 500-600 years that Protestants have declared there can be no mistakes in the Bible.
Well, I'm not sure about that. For example, like Clement and Irenaeus talked about shit. Even Justin Martyr did. Now that you bring up Justin Martyr, I've got. Hold on, I'm going to find you a quote from him. Justin Martyr says, I am entirely convinced that no scripture contradicts another. I shall admit that I do not understand what is recorded, and shall strive to persuade those who imagine that the scriptures are contradictory to be rather of the same opinion myself. So Justin himself says that the scriptures can't contradict, although there are some that seem confusing. But we do in fact have real contradictions.
Well, I would also say what when Justin Martyr says that, what is established canon scripture at that point?
Well, Justin Martyr, if you read his writings, believed in the Protestant canon plus the apocryphal works. In fact, he goes on a pretty long bender defending the apocryphal works, claiming that it was the Jews seeking to remove them from the Bible in a big conspiracy to eliminate some of the prophecies about Jesus.
Okay, yeah, yeah, but when we point to like you brought up Mark, right? And I don't know this. I'm more asking, putting it out there. Like was Mark established canon scripture by that point?
Yeah, I would imagine so. It seems to be the earliest gospel written, and I forget who all is on the Muratorian fragment, but I would imagine Justin would have known about them. Justin quotes pretty readily from the canon that we know of.
Yeah. Okay. Uh, so,
I mean, and doubting Mark
well, what,
as being scripture would be pretty drastic.
oh no, 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 I wasn't saying, but like when Paul or Peter references scripture, they are
Hmm.
talking about the Old Testament, right? So it gets a little muddied there. Like when Peter references, if Peter actually wrote the books of First, Second, and Third Peter, when he references scripture, he's not talking about Ephesians, right? He's talking about the Old Testament.
Yeah, I mean, so there's some questions as to what Paul meant when he says scripture. Paul seems to be referring to the Old Testament. There's a line in Second Peter chapter 3 where Second Peter refers to Paul's writings as scripture. So it seems that later tradition was pretty ready to include Paul's writings as scripture. And I would imagine the
Yes, I know.
Gospels as well.
Yeah, I know Polycarp said that Paul's writings were inspired scripture. He was fully on board that train.
Yeah.
Um, what was the point that before I brought up Justin Martyr? What was the point? What were
Well, the point was that it's the biblical inerrancy debate has been going on since the
oh
very
yes.
beginning, and I think it is kind of important. Like if we're talking about the historicity of scripture and the accuracy of scripture, and then I find passages that seem to be out of line with history or science or even contradicts itself, I'm not inclined to believe that the book itself is reliable.
Well, I think it's also important to look at each book as its own standalone book. They were not compiled together as the Bible at the time.
Sure, but
Uh,
if it's all from
and
God,
if
it
we
shouldn't
if,
contradict.
well, uh, again, I think do I do not take scripture as literal word for word from God. I take it as divinely inspired by God to show himself to us through people, albeit flawed.
If God divinely inspired it, why wouldn't he just inspire it in a way in which it wouldn't be flawed? Why wouldn't he make it accurate?
Well, a lot of people do believe that. I
Hmm.
just think that you can't hold that line and be correct,
I'm
uh,
with you.
because there are things in there that the argument I always hear is that exemption is not contradiction, right? But like, how many angels were at the tomb? Okay, somebody could look at that and say, look, one gospel says there's one angel, one gospel says there's two angels, therefore the gospels are not true, and I shouldn't believe. Or one gospel says Jesus was crucified on Passover, the others say the day before, right?
Yep, that's correct. Yep.
So, yeah, the more logical thing I think to believe is that, okay, you have 60, 70 authors who are trying to compile the history of what they saw, and they're going to miss the mark sometimes, but most of the time they're going to accurately reflect what they've seen, heard, believe, and know.
Well, I think that's true for some of the books of the Hebrew Bible. I don't think it's necessarily true for some of what we find in the New Testament. Like the New Testament can't even read the Hebrew Bible correctly. So it misquotes it at every turn, or it quotes from editions that seem to be lost to history. We don't have them. And then, on the other hand, it's completely out of context. Like every time the New Testament is quoting the Old Testament, it's quoting it out of context. Like half the time, it's quoting prophecies. They're not even prophecies. They're just random like snippets from one of the Psalms. So like,
Like,
I'm not encouraged that the
are,
New Testament authors were inspired when they keep lying to my face.
what are you talking about? Like how Isaiah's original translation says "young girl, not virgin," or like the crimson worm. What are some things you're talking about?
I like, for example, in Matthew, right? I'm sorry, in John. I'm thinking. Give me a second to remember which chapter is it. John 19, John 13. I think it's John 13. So in John 13, Jesus is predicting his own betrayal. Yeah, John 13:18 is the one. Let me grab it real quick. And Jesus says something really interesting in John. It says, "I'm not speaking of all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but it is to fulfill the scripture. The one who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. So Jesus is suggesting like the situation here is that this scripture needs to be fulfilled. So he's treating this as though it's prophecy, right? But if you go to where this shows up, which is in Psalm 41, it's not a prophecy at all. Like it's just a random quotation from Psalm 41. In fact, the person speaking here literally says, "Heal me, I have sinned against you." It's obviously not about the Messiah. It's not a prophecy. He just found a random verse in a random psalm that talked about betrayal and said, "Well, it's a prophecy now." That's not. You wouldn't accept that in the Quran. You wouldn't accept that in any other holy book. Why would you accept that in the Bible?
Mm, yeah, obviously I'm biased towards my own worldview, but I'd say just the greater concept of betrayal is a prophecy fulfilled, right?
I don't think so. No. Like an actual prophecy needs to be specific. Like God actually needs to be clearly speaking through a prophet saying X, Y, and Z is going to happen. It can't just be a randomly grabbed verse from a random passage in the Hebrew Bible that sounds like something that you want it to be
Yes.
about.
Yeah, but when we do have specific examples, like the flight to Egypt is prophesized, people will
Sure about that
shoot that
one?
down and say, "Oh, but it's only in one gospel," or
No.
that he'll be from Nazareth. Oh, it's not in any gospel, or the Virgin, or from Bethlehem and Micah, right?
I
It's
mean,
like
all of
we,
these are important prophecies, except that the one you started with is not a prophecy. Hosea 11, the prophecy doesn't start until verse 5. Hosea 11, 1 and 2 is history. In fact, 1 through 4 is history. He says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." This is a direct quotation from Exodus chapter 4. It says, "The more I called them, the more they went from me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to idols." This is not about a Messiah. This is about the nation of Israel. This is what happened during the Exodus. It's all in the
uh,
past tense.
e- yes, but Jesus is supposed to act as a new Moses, like bring in a new law,
No,
bring
he's
in a new
not.
covenant.
That's not in the Hebrew Bible anywhere.
Uh, well, that's I think the parallels. Excuse me, I got something in my throat. The parallels are like an obvious connection that we can just make
Why?
without it. I don't know. That's what we do with literature, right? When you
I
read that the
wouldn't.
curtains were blue, no, you don't. You don't.
The question is, what is a prophecy? A prophecy is not just any words on a page that sound like what you want them to sound like. A prophecy is like a clear pattern of speech. In fact, God tells you how to test a prophet in Deuteronomy 18. He says, if the words of the prophet does not come true or prove to be true, then that prophet is not speaking for Yahweh, and you must kill that prophet for speaking presumptuously. So like a prophecy from a prophet is like an actual like piece of information that you can test. It's not just like any random words on a page.
Okay, I agree with that. But like the example you just gave, did Jesus say, "Here's the prophecy," or did he just say, "I fulfilled this"?
Well, Jesus didn't say it. So this was listed by Matthew. Like if you go to Matthew 2,
Okay.
he lists it in verse 14, I believe, 14 or 15. Let me grab that. In 14, yeah, it says Joseph got up and took the child and his mother by night and went to Egypt. And then in 15, he says, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, out of Egypt I have called my son. So Matthew is interpreting it as though it's a prophecy, which is why I don't trust Matthew.
So, is there anything? Do you think that there's any uh, actual history recorded in the New Testament, or do you think it's all fabricated, written later? Like, what's your
Well,
stance on?
Well, I believe there was a guy named Jesus who came around and was like a Jewish teacher, maybe even a magician or a wise man. that ended up getting killed by the state. That certainly is something that I can find believable based on the evidence that we have. But I think the stories that are told about them are quite mythological, and we've got similar stories about other people from history that, when you look at the earliest stories, they were quite normal. And then over time, the stories about them grow and grow and grow until they're like demigods. And I think that's what happened with Jesus.
Yeah, that's somewhat plausible, except it doesn't grow and grow over time. It's almost immediate.
Well, I don't think so.
It's like Jesus is crucified, and there's immediately people worshiping him as God.
Oh, I don't think so at all. I mean, the earliest gospel of Mark is quite ambiguous about his deified position. It seems like he's more got an adoptionist theology, like Jesus is like the adopted son of the Father, similar to what the Greeks and the Romans did. You don't get like a Jesus true demigod until you get to the book of John, which is quite late.
Yeah, but Mark makes some claims like when they only God can forgive sins, and then Jesus says, "Okay, I forgive sins."
Well, no, he says the Son of Man, right? So the question is, what authority does the Son of Man have? So the Son of Man, if you remember correctly, is a figure that shows up in Daniel chapter 7, also shows up
Mhm.
in the book of Enoch and in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's like this messianic title. And so Jesus is explaining what authority the Son of Man has. He's saying that the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins, which is because God gave it to him. Because remember, the whole shtick is that all authority in heaven and earth has been given to the Son of Man. So he's just basically clarifying, yes, the Son of Man does in fact have the power to do some of these things that only God can do.
Yes, only God can do. Like
Hmm.
ride the clouds, forgive sins.
Yeah.
God, the Old Testament says God does not share His glory, but then somehow Jesus has all the glory of God in even the Gospel of Mark.
Actually, I mean, you basically just created a good contradiction. I've used this one before. The only way around this, you're quoting from Isaiah chapter 45, if I remember correctly. The only way around this is to say that Jesus is God, because otherwise you got a big problem. If Yahweh doesn't share his glory with another, he says, "There's no gods created before me, nor none after me." Then the only way to square this round peg is to say that Jesus actually is Yahweh, which creates a crazy logical contradiction.
I mean, that's just the belief of mainstream Christianity that
I know. Yeah.
Jesus is the second person of the Trinity.
I know. Yeah, but it's a logical contradiction. The Trinity is incoherent. Like it's either one God or it's three gods, but it's not three in one.
Why would that be a contradiction?
Because 1 + 1 + 1 equals three.
Yeah,
So
three in one.
three
It's
gods.
like
Nope.
no, it's not three gods. That would be polytheism.
I agree. Yes. Yeah. The Trinity would be polytheism if you're using like actual logic.
Well, would you agree? Would you say that the Hebrews were monotheistic?
No, I think the Hebrews were henotheistic.
Okay, yeah. No,
In
I was
fact,
going to say because we see in the Sodom and Gomorrah story, Yahweh on earth rains fire from Yahweh in heaven.
no, it's not Yahweh on earth. It doesn't say that. That's Genesis 19. It says Yahweh rained down fire from Yahweh in heaven. It doesn't say that he was on the earth. In fact, if you read the narrative, it's quite clear that Yahweh appeared in Genesis 18 with two other angels. And then the two angels departed and went to Sodom, and Yahweh went back home to heaven. So it's just a clarification of where Yahweh is when he rains down the fire and sulfur. And the Talmud actually deals with this quite well, because there's quite a few instances where this type of sentence structure shows up. I think the earliest is in the lineage given in Genesis when it talks about Lamech. Um, and Lamech refers to himself in the third person as well. So personally, I think like these little grammatical anomalies are just artifacts from copying errors. But that being said, there's so many of them, I would be reluctant to use one of them to dream up some kind of a trinity.
Okay. Uh, I only have a couple minutes left, and
Mhm.
you seem very knowledgeable. I'm actually blown away with how much, like, you can just say, "Oh yeah, that's Isaiah 45." So I've had something that I've been really wrestling with. That I'm going to assume you've probably heard of. In Deuteronomy, do you know the scene where Elyon is distributing the nations?
Yeah, 32:8. Mhm.
Yes. I've done a ton of reading, and it's all biased, right? At least the Christian. If you get it from a Christian source, it's biased to no. Monotheism didn't develop over time. It was always there. El Elyon is Yahweh,
Yeah.
but it doesn't seem that way. What do you do with that from your perspective?
Okay, so there's a scholar who I think provides the best explanation for this problem. And for those who don't know, let me put it on the screen. Deuteronomy 32:8 says, when the Most High, that's Elyon in Hebrew, apportioned the nations, when he divided humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the people according to the number of the gods. Yahweh's own portion was his people, Jacob, his allotted share. So, based on the reading of the text, basically it's suggesting that Yahweh was part of a pantheon rather than equivalent with Elyon. So, that's how most people read this. Now, Mark S. Smith has done quite a bit of work on this. He's a scholar of the Bible in the ancient Near East. And he's written a book that you might want to check out. Give me a second. That kind of develops this track into monotheism. The name of the book is The Origins of Biblical Monotheism, Israel's Polytheistic Background and the Ugaritic Text by Mark S. Smith. And he's no chump. I forget where he teaches at. It's like Oxford or Princeton or something. Give me a second to recall. Let's see. Mark S. Smith. Where does he teach at? Yale. He graduated from Yale. But where is he currently teaching? Let's see where it says blah 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 blah. He went to Johns Hopkins, then he went to Yale. He went to Harvard as well. Well, shit, where does he teach at now? He can't be retired. Princeton. Okay, he became the professor of Old Testament literature and exegesis at Princeton Theological Seminary. So, I mean, the guy's not a schmuck. But anyways, his general consensus is that originally Yahweh was one of many gods, as implied by this text and other texts. And then later, when the Judeans supplanted the Israelites as the dominant power, the Judeans basically converged the Judean Yahwistic cult with the El cult of the northern tribes. It would be worthwhile to read a couple books on the Israelite religious system. Most scholars nowadays believe that the Judeans and the Israelites were two separate nations, and that they didn't really have a shared cultural heritage like people want to think, and that they kind of combined their nation into one nation when the Assyrian Empire devastated the northern tribes, and many of them escaped into Judah for protection. They kind of had to merge their two ethnic and religious identities. And that's why we have passages that seem to be making excuses, like in Exodus chapter 6. There's a verse in chapter 6 that seems to be an explanation for why there's like two different names of God. It says, God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. So this is a later text, and it appears that the goal of this text is to explain why some of our people know about El and why some of our people know about Yahweh. And they're trying to say, no, it's actually the same God. But this particular text appears to be a much later text.
Yeah, I think there's also a recollect. I can't think of the word. Where you try to reconcile, recolatory. What's the word I'm looking for?
I think
There's
reconcile is
also
a
a
good
passage.
word.
Yeah, yeah. There's also a passage in Psalms where they try to reconcile that Elion and Yahweh are the same.
Yes, yeah. There's actually a couple. In fact, in my cheat sheet, I've got a deconstruction cheat sheet. I've got a couple passages listed in the appendix of where they tend to conflate the names of God to make it appear like they're all the same. Give me a second to see where some of those passages were. My sheet's getting too long at this point. So there's a couple passages that seem to equate Yahweh with Elyon, which would be Psalm 7, Psalm 9, Psalm 18, Psalm 21, Psalm 47, Psalm 77. And then my favorites are Psalm 83 and Psalm 92. All of the and Psalm 97. All of these psalms seem to be equating Elyon and Yahweh. And there's a couple reasons why this is the case. There is, if I'm being really charitable to the history of the Bible, I could say that this literally came from the Davidic United Monarchy, and suggest that what happened during the Assyrian invasion also happened during the United Monarchy. And that's personally my theory. I think it's harder to prove, and a lot of scholars agree with me, but they can't prove it. Meaning I agree with them. But I believe that when David became king and solidified his power, I believe the North and the South, who were originally two different people groups, actually did merge for a time period and become one united kingdom. And when they did, there was a concerted effort by the court, the king's court, to mix their religious backgrounds and try to make one solid religious background so that the kingdom could remain united. But I don't think the effort was good enough, which is why it split only 1.5 generations later.
Well, unfortunately, I got to work at 8 o'clock. But
I understand. Yeah.
appreciate you talking to me.
Yeah, Ben, thanks for coming up, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you have a good night.
Cheers.